I'm Benjamin, 27, and I've always been the responsible one in my family. The one who cleans up messes, the one who never complains, the one who silently absorbs everyone else's drama while pretending it doesn't bother me. Growing up, I thought it was just my nature to be patient, to let things slide, and to keep the peace. But lately, that patience has been wearing thinner than the soles of my favorite sneakers. I've realized that in a family like mine, being responsible often just makes you a target for everyone else's entitlement. My mom, my dad, and my sister have always had this unspoken hierarchy where I'm last on the list for anything fun or rewarding. It's subtle at first, a sarcastic comment here, a dismissive eye roll there. But over the years, it's piled up into this constant pressure that no one outside the family could ever understand. And this summer, it seems like they decided to make it official. It all started with a text in our family group chat, which I had been trying to ignore because, frankly, it's mostly just a place for them to vent at me or one another. My phone buzzed, and there it was, a string of messages that felt like a punch to the gut all at once. "We're going on vacation without you or the kids this summer," my mom wrote. I stared at it for a solid 10 seconds, rereading it like maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. Vacation without me? Without my niece and nephew? It sounded more like an announcement than a conversation, and the casual cruelty stung worse than I thought it would. Before I even had time to react, my sister chimed in, clearly having read my mom's message and decided to pile on. "But make sure you keep the house clean while we're gone." Then my dad, almost like a cherry on top of this passive-aggressive sundae, added, "Oh, and don't forget to feed the pets." I didn't reply, not because I wasn't furious, but because I needed a second to process the sheer absurdity of it. My family had never been subtle, but this was something new. I could almost hear their collective smirks through the screen. The message didn't just sting, it hit deeper because it wasn't even hidden in disguise. I was expected to act like their personal housekeeper and pet sitter while they went off to enjoy themselves, presumably laughing about how responsible Benjamin would hold down the fort. And I hated to admit it, but for a moment, I felt that familiar pang of resentment, that simmering anger I had buried under years of forced smiles and polite nods. I had spent my mornings running errands for them, afternoons cleaning up after everyone, and evenings trying to maintain some semblance of a life that wasn't entirely dictated by my family's whims. And yet here I was, being treated like a fixture in their lives, something permanent and useful, but never someone they needed to include in their plans or care about in any meaningful way. It wasn't the first time I'd been sidelined, but it was the first time the slight was so blatant. My sister has always been the one to get attention, the one whose opinions mattered, the one whose plans took precedence. She's 3 years younger than me, which makes it even more ridiculous. She's always been able to bend our parents to her will, and I've spent most of my life watching it happen, helpless, frustrated, and furious. I sat there staring at my phone, scrolling up through the chat to see if I had missed some sort of context that might soften the blow. There was none. The previous messages were about dinner plans and some minor family errands, all of which revolved around my sister's schedule or my mom's whims. I realized then that this wasn't a mistake, it wasn't a joke, it wasn't a momentary lapse in thoughtfulness. This was intentional. This was a pattern they'd perfected over the years, and now they were testing just how much I would take before finally snapping, or before I accepted that this was my role forever. I could feel the familiar knot of frustration in my stomach, the one that builds when someone pushes your patience past the limit but knows exactly how to do it without giving you an excuse to lash out. I imagined my mom and sister probably sitting together in the living room, laughing and making plans, while my dad nodded along, pleased with himself for delegating all the boring work to me. The thought of them packing bags, making lists, and getting excited while I stayed home, scrubbing floors and feeding pets, made my blood boil quietly. I kept picturing the scene again and again, as if replaying it might give me some kind of insight into how I had ended up here, or maybe just to let the anger simmer longer. I tried to tell myself to stay calm. After all, I'm not the type to cause scenes, or at least, I hadn't been, not until now. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this time, I didn't have to stay silent. For years, I'd been the responsible one, the one who took the brunt of their entitlement with a polite smile. But as I stared at that chat, something shifted inside me. I didn't want to just stew silently anymore. I wanted them to see, to really understand, that I wasn't invisible, that I wasn't just a cog in their little family machine. And for the first time in a long time, I started thinking about how I might make that happen. It wasn't just about being left out. It wasn't just about cleaning the house or feeding the pets while they lounged on a beach somewhere. It was about respect, or the lack thereof. It was about years of being treated like a backup option, like someone whose time and effort were valuable only when convenient. I felt the familiar surge of indignation, the one I've learned to channel carefully, because my family responds poorly to confrontation. But this time, I didn't feel like holding back. I wanted them to see the consequences of treating me like I was disposable. I wanted to remind them, in a way they couldn't ignore, that I had agency, that I had a voice, and most importantly, that I could make my own rules in this family, rather than following theirs blindly. I spent the next few minutes thinking through options. Ignoring them would feel satisfying in a small, temporary way, but I needed more than that. A text, a phone call, a passive reply, they wouldn't suffice. I needed leverage, something that would disrupt their little vacation fantasy and make them reconsider their automatic assumption that I would play servant without question. I could hear their voices in my head, my mom's patronizing tone, my sister's smug laugh, my dad's indifferent shrug. Each of them was so used to getting what they wanted without effort. But not this time. Not this summer. I needed to plan carefully, because my family might underestimate me, but that doesn't mean I couldn't outmaneuver them. And then I started thinking about the logistics. Their vacation was 3 weeks away. Plenty of time to prepare. I thought about my sister's favorite outfits, the routines my mom insisted upon, the exact schedule my dad had been counting on for feeding the pets and maintaining the house. I realized I had all the information I needed to make a point that would be slow, calculated, and impossible for them to ignore. I didn't know exactly what that would look like yet, but the seed of it had been planted. I could almost feel it growing inside me, that mix of anticipation and quiet rage that fuels careful, deliberate plans. By the time I put my phone down, I knew one thing for certain. This summer would not go according to their plan. For the first time, I wasn't just the responsible one. I was the one with the power to make them think twice, to make them understand, without a word, that taking me for granted came with consequences. And even though I didn't know exactly how it would unfold yet, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a thrill at the idea of finally asserting myself, quietly but unmistakably, in a family that had always assumed I would stay in my place. I took a deep breath and went into the kitchen, staring at the neatly stacked dishes, the spotless counters, the quiet hum of a house that was about to become a stage for something I had been imagining for weeks. My mind raced with possibilities, each more precise and satisfying than the last. For once, I wasn't imagining their disappointment. I was imagining their shock, their frustration, their inability to predict what I was about to do. And somehow, that felt like freedom. The next few days were a blur of irritation and simmering anger. I tried to go about my normal routine, work, errands, cooking, cleaning, but every little interaction with my family reminded me of how invisible I was, and how they seemed to expect me to disappear into the background whenever it suited them. My sister was on a roll, full of energy, planning her vacation wardrobe, checking online for activities, and even posting pictures of potential hotel rooms in the family group chat, as if I wasn't part of the family at all. Every time I saw her glowing smile in those pictures, I felt that same knot in my stomach tighten. She didn't just get attention, she demanded it, and everyone bent to her whims without a second thought. My mom was worse. She started calling me Benjamin, sweetie, don't forget, for everything, even things I had already done. Benjamin, sweetie, don't forget to check the locks before we leave. Benjamin, sweetie, make sure you water the plants. Every time she said it, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and anger wash over me. She was acting like I was both incapable and obligated at the same time, a human tool that she could assign tasks to at her convenience. And my dad, ever the silent enabler, would nod along, muttering, "Yeah, that's right. Make sure it's all done," like my mom's instructions were some divine decree and I was only there to obey. It was all so frustratingly familiar, and yet somehow sharper this time, more blatant, more impossible to ignore. I tried to keep my cool, tried to rationalize it in my head. Maybe they were just excited, I told myself. Maybe this was normal family behavior. But deep down, I knew it wasn't normal. I knew that the way I was treated was unfair, that years of favoritism toward my sister had created a pattern of entitlement that had only intensified over time. And yet, even knowing that, I couldn't shake the creeping feeling of helplessness that had always accompanied these situations. Until, that is, it happened. The moment that finally pushed me past the breaking point. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I had spent the morning cleaning the kitchen, doing laundry, and organizing the living room. I was exhausted, but tried to take a moment to sit down with a cup of coffee, thinking maybe I could just breathe for 5 minutes before diving into dinner prep. That's when my sister walked in, her phone glued to her hand, eyes scanning something on the screen. I tried to ignore her at first, but the conversation was impossible to miss. "Oh my God, Mom, you will not believe this," she said, her voice dripping with excitement. "Look at this deal I just got for the resort. We could totally upgrade our room for free if we book now." My mom's laugh followed immediately, high-pitched and indulgent, while my dad made a low, approving hum from the corner of the room. "Wow, that sounds amazing, honey," my mom said, leaning over my sister's shoulder as she scrolled through the screen. "Benjamin, you're still handling dinner tonight, right?" I froze. I was standing just a few feet away, holding the coffee mug like it was some kind of shield, and yet they were completely oblivious to my presence. My sister didn't even look at me. She was too busy bouncing on her heels, excited about the vacation. My mom's voice was like a needle in my chest, calm, polite, but loaded with the assumption that I existed solely to serve them. Yeah, dinner's fine," I said, my voice flat. I wanted to be invisible, but I also wanted them to hear the edge in my tone, the warning beneath the calm. "Oh good," my mom said, smiling sweetly. "Don't forget to set the table early. We don't want to interrupt your work schedule." My sister snickered at that, like it was the funniest joke in the world. My dad just nodded, looking pleased with the arrangement. And that's when it hit me. I realized they weren't just dismissing me. They were taking pleasure in it. They were actively enjoying the knowledge that I was going to spend my time catering to their lives while they planned theirs. And the kicker, the moment that truly broke something inside me, came when my sister said, "Oh, and Ben, don't even think about asking to come along. You know how Mom feels about it." I felt my chest tighten so much I thought I might actually choke. It wasn't just a text or a minor comment. It was a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. They had made it clear. I was excluded, invisible, a secondary character in the story of their lives. All the years of subtle dismissal, of being ignored, of watching my sister get everything I wanted and more, came flooding back. I felt anger, but also betrayal, deep and stinging. This wasn't just unfair. It was cruel, and it was intentional. I retreated to my room, slamming the door just enough to make my point without provoking a scene. I sat on my bed, my hands gripping the edge like I could physically hold myself together. I replayed the conversation in my head, over and over, each repetition sharpening the sting. Every polite smile, every sarcastic remark, every expectation they had ever piled on me suddenly made sense as a long-running pattern of control. And for the first time in my adult life, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of it. Not just anger, but sadness, frustration, and disbelief. I stayed in my room for hours, thinking, analyzing, trying to decide how I could respond. I knew I couldn't react impulsively. That would just feed them, let them think they had won. I needed a plan, something calculated, something that would make them recognize, without a doubt, that their treatment of me had consequences. I started making lists in my notebook, small ways to test them, ways to subtly push back, ways to reclaim some sense of agency. Maybe I'd leave something unfinished or rearrange their little vacation plans in harmless ways. The point wasn't to ruin their trip. It was to remind them that I wasn't just their invisible helper, their afterthought. But even as I plotted, the betrayal lingered in my mind. It wasn't just the exclusion or the demands or the constant favoritism. It was the knowledge that they didn't even see me as part of the family in any meaningful sense. They could plan, laugh, and celebrate without me. They could assume I'd handle everything at home without even asking if I wanted to be involved. And they did it with such confidence, such certainty, that I realized the extent to which I had been underestimated all my life. That night, dinner was the hardest part. My sister was bubbly, recounting her online finds, showing my mom the vacation itinerary, while my dad nodded along, making approving comments. I sat at the table, silent, carefully plating my own food as if nothing had happened. Every bite felt like an act of defiance. I didn't speak. I didn't react. I just ate, keeping my thoughts to myself while they celebrated a future that I wasn't allowed to be part of. And then came the real shock, the moment that confirmed my worst fears about them. The moment I realized that the betrayal wasn't just emotional or symbolic, but concrete. My mom, in her usual sweet, caring tone, turned to me mid-meal and said, "Oh, Benjamin, by the way, we decided to hire someone to take care of the pets while we're gone. We thought it would be better than bothering you." I froze mid-bite. The knife in my hand felt heavier than it should have. The words hit like a physical blow. All that planning I had imagined, all that preparation I had done to hold the house together, they hadn't even considered me necessary. I was completely replaceable. My sister's grin widened as she added, "Yeah, we figured you'd want to relax too. You know, since you work so hard." My dad nodded solemnly, pleased with the decision, completely missing the irony of their words. I felt something inside me crack, a mixture of rage, humiliation, and disbelief. The person who had spent decades being the responsible one, the one who had silently held everything together, was now irrelevant. And just like that, I understood that nothing short of something drastic would make them see me, not as a servant, not as an afterthought, but as someone who had boundaries, agency, and the ability to act. I sat there, staring at my plate, the room spinning slightly with the force of my emotions. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what might happen if I didn't just endure it, if I didn't just silently play my role. The idea of taking control, of turning the tables in a way that would make them understand, really understand, what it felt like to underestimate me, began to form. But I also knew I had to wait, had to plan, had to ensure that when the moment came, it was undeniable, unmissable, and unarguable. I excused myself from the table without a word and went back to my room. I closed the door, leaned against it, and let out a long breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding. This wasn't just about the vacation anymore. It wasn't even about the house or the pets. This was about respect. This was about finally asserting myself in a family that had always taken me for granted. And for the first time, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in years. Hope that maybe, just maybe, I could finally make them see me, not as Benjamin the invisible, the responsible, the replaceable, but as someone who could no longer be ignored. The days after the vacation announcement felt like walking through molasses. Every interaction with my family reinforced the fact that they had no intention of treating me as anything other than invisible labor, a background fixture, or a placeholder for their convenience. I found myself moving through the motions, cleaning, cooking, and tending to the pets, all while they planned, booked, and excitedly discussed the trip that didn't include me. At first, I tried to make sense of it, to rationalize their behavior, to believe that maybe they simply hadn't considered my feelings. But the truth was unavoidable. This was intentional. They had spent decades conditioning me to accept the role they'd designed for me, and now they were capitalizing on it, taking it to its logical extreme. I started avoiding the family group chat, muting notifications, and retreating into my room more often. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart sank. Not from anxiety, but from the sheer weight of anticipation, wondering which directive, which subtle insult, which reminder of my expendability would appear next. I realized with growing clarity that I had been living for them, molding my life around their preferences, while mine had been quietly dismissed for years. It was a painful realization, one that left me feeling hollow, frustrated, and, honestly, a little hopeless. The breaking point came on a Wednesday. I had been doing laundry when my sister burst into my room, holding her phone like it was a trophy. "Mom says you better get the yard done before we leave," she announced, grinning like it was a joke. "And don't forget to trim the bushes exactly like she showed you last year. We don't want any mistakes." Her tone was teasing, but the message behind it was crystal clear. I existed solely to anticipate and fulfill their desires, and if I didn't, there would be consequences in the form of guilt tripping, passive aggressiveness, or outright scorn. I wanted to scream, to throw her phone across the room, to tell her exactly what I thought of her smug sense of entitlement, but instead, I did the one thing I had learned over the years to master. I forced a smile, nodded, and walked out. Inside, though, a storm was raging. I felt exhausted, trapped, and insignificant, like I was drowning in a life that had never been mine to begin with. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was always going to be the family's invisible servant, always going to be the one left behind, while everyone else chased fun, recognition, and validation. For the first time in years, I let myself feel utterly defeated. I didn't just feel angry. I felt invisible, unimportant, and, worst of all, replaceable. The realization that my hard work and dedication had been met with indifference and dismissal for so long hit harder than I expected. I questioned myself constantly. Why did I allow this? Why did I let them dictate my sense of worth? And for the first time, I confronted the truth I had been avoiding for years. My family didn't see me as a person with feelings, ambitions, or limits. They saw me as a function, a tool, a cog in their convenient little system. That night, I cried in silence, not just for the vacation, not just for the neglect, but for years of being overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated. It was a cathartic release, a reckoning with the invisible weight I had carried for so long. I realized that if I continued on this path, I would remain trapped in their system indefinitely, defined by their whims and expectations rather than my own choices. And yet, in that despair, something unexpected began to form. A seed of defiance, tiny but persistent, that whispered I didn't have to stay broken. I started thinking, in small, careful steps, about what life might look like if I put myself first for once. I began to imagine a version of myself who wasn't the background character in my family's narrative, but the author of my own story. At first, these were fleeting thoughts, almost too fragile to hold on to, but they grew more persistent, more insistent, like a quiet drumbeat beneath the chaos of my life. The next morning, I decided to reclaim a small piece of control. I started with minor changes, making breakfast for myself instead of everyone else, going for long walks during hours they expected me to be at their beck and call, even taking a few evenings off from housework to focus on personal projects I had long neglected. Each small act felt revolutionary. It was like discovering muscles I hadn't known I possessed, muscles of independence, self-worth, and personal boundaries. I realized I had spent so long responding to my family's demands that I had forgotten what it felt like to act solely for myself. Slowly, I began rebuilding a sense of identity that had nothing to do with them. I signed up for a few courses I'd been putting off, started exercising regularly, not because anyone told me to, but because I wanted to feel stronger, more capable. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years, people who treated me as a person rather than an obligation. I even started exploring hobbies I had abandoned, like painting and writing, which had once brought me joy but had been overshadowed by years of caretaking. Each small victory, each reclaiming of time and attention, felt like a quiet rebellion, a way of asserting my worth in a family that had long denied it. And then came the first tangible signs of change in their perception, though they didn't recognize it as such. When I politely declined to reorganize the living room for the third time that week, my mom's smile faltered. When I spent an afternoon painting in the backyard instead of trimming the bushes to her exact specifications, my sister's teasing turned into something sharper, more suspicious. And when I started refusing to take on extra tasks they had previously assumed were mine, my dad's approval no longer accompanied his nods. Instead, there was tension, a barely concealed frustration. I realized with quiet satisfaction that their confidence in my compliance had begun to waver. I felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. On one hand, asserting myself against a family that had conditioned me for compliance was terrifying. I had no idea how far they might push back, or what lengths they might go to in order to maintain control. On the other hand, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. For the first time, I was acting deliberately, not reactively, shaping my own reality instead of responding to theirs. It was intoxicating, empowering, and deeply satisfying, even in small doses. By the end of that week, I had made significant progress in quietly reclaiming my life. I hadn't yet confronted them directly, nor had I revealed any of the plans forming in my mind. But I felt stronger, more confident, and more aware of my own value. I realized that for the first time in years, I was no longer their invisible servant. I was Benjamin, the one who could act, decide, and assert boundaries. I was learning that my power didn't come from confrontation alone, but from the deliberate, patient cultivation of independence and self-worth. Yet, despite these personal victories, the shadow of betrayal still lingered. Their smug indifference, the blatant favoritism toward my sister, the expectation that I exist solely for their convenience. All of it remained, like a dark cloud hanging over every interaction. I knew that reclaiming my life quietly was only the first step. There was still a larger reckoning coming, something that would require careful planning, patience, and strategy. I couldn't just rebuild myself in isolation. I had to prepare for the inevitable moment when my family's entitlement would collide with my newfound strength. And then, as if on cue, the first real spark of that collision appeared. My sister had been bragging to her friends about the upcoming vacation, completely unaware, or deliberately ignoring, the fact that I had begun taking steps to assert myself. My mom called me that evening with a list of chores that had suddenly doubled, framed as helpful suggestions, while my dad looked on approvingly. I realized in that moment that they still underestimated me, believed I would continue to comply without question, and assumed that my newfound independence was fragile enough to crumble under pressure. But I had changed. I had tasted the possibility of control, of personal agency, of standing on my own terms. That night, lying in bed, I felt a mixture of anticipation and resolve. I knew the next steps had to be deliberate. I couldn't rush. I couldn't let emotions dictate my actions. I had to be strategic, methodical, and patient. The betrayal, the exclusion, the entitlement, they had all laid the groundwork for what was coming. And for the first time, I truly understood that the slow, quiet rise I was experiencing wasn't just about reclaiming my life. It was about preparing to take back everything they had taken for granted, to make them confront the consequences of underestimating me for so long. I closed my eyes, a plan slowly forming in my mind, layer by layer, like a blueprint for something monumental. I didn't yet know exactly how it would unfold, but I knew one thing. My family would no longer see me as someone to be ignored, dismissed, or taken advantage of. And that knowledge, fragile and exhilarating as it was, made the long nights of frustration, betrayal, and self-doubt suddenly feel like the necessary prelude to something far bigger, something powerful, something inevitable. If I wanted to truly make my family understand, I needed a plan, something precise, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. I had spent years reacting to their entitlement, silently absorbing their favoritism, and accommodating their whims. Now it was my turn to dictate the terms, to turn the tables, and to make them see, finally, that I was neither invisible nor replaceable. But I also knew patience was crucial. Rushing in would ruin the effect, alert them to my intentions too soon, and they would find ways to undermine me before the moment arrived. It started with observation. I became almost surgical in tracking their routines, habits, and expectations. I noted my mom's obsessive attention to detail, how she expected the house to look perfect at all times. I observed my sister's patterns, her reliance on everyone else for last-minute favors, her assumption that she was always the center of attention. I even took mental notes on my dad's predictable indulgence, how he never questioned anyone's actions, yet silently approved when tasks were delegated to me. Every word, gesture, and habit became data, a way to understand the exact levers I could pull to disrupt their sense of control. At the same time, I started quietly building my own little support network. Friends I had lost touch with over the years suddenly became invaluable. I reached out under casual pretenses, reconnecting over coffee, shared memories, and mutual support. I didn't explicitly explain my plan, but I found that just talking about the family, the patterns of entitlement and exclusion, elicited reactions that reinforced my sense of clarity. They listened, they validated, and more importantly, they reminded me that the way my family treated me wasn't normal. That outside perspective fueled a growing confidence, a quiet certainty that I could finally act without fear. I also began reclaiming my space at home in subtle but deliberate ways. I reorganized rooms in ways that made daily chores easier for me, but slightly disrupted the flow my family was used to. I planted flowers in unusual arrangements, moved furniture to positions that maximized efficiency for me, and even rearranged the pantry so that retrieving anything took a slightly different rhythm than my mom had expected. To anyone else, these changes would seem minor or even inconsequential, but to my family, who thrived on control and predictability, the slightest deviation could be unsettling. It was a way of reminding them, quietly, that I was no longer their passive fixture. The next stage was timing. I knew their vacation was just over a month away, and I realized that this window was perfect. Any action I took too early would give them time to adapt, to manipulate, to regain control. Any action I took too late would feel reactive, like I had been forced into it. I needed a moment when the stakes were highest, when their confidence was at its peak, and when they assumed I would be entirely compliant. That moment would ensure maximum impact, an unmistakable statement that I had reclaimed authority in a household that had long underestimated me. While observing and planning, I also began testing boundaries. Small acts at first, leaving minor chores incomplete, offering subtle suggestions that contradicted their preferences, politely refusing unnecessary tasks. Each time, I watched their reactions closely. My sister would frown, her smug confidence faltering for a fraction of a second. My mom would give a tight smile, her eyes flicking toward my dad for silent approval. And my dad, well, he would usually shrug, but there was always a momentary hesitation, as if the invisible scaffolding of authority they had relied on for decades had been shaken. These minor victories fueled my resolve. Every small success built momentum, and with momentum came courage. I started envisioning the final outcome. In my mind, I could see their faces, the exact expressions of shock, frustration, and disbelief as they realized their carefully orchestrated vacation and expectations had been subtly undermined. I didn't want chaos. I wanted control. I didn't want anger. I wanted comprehension. I wanted them to understand, without ambiguity, that I was no longer someone to be taken for granted. It wasn't revenge for the sake of cruelty. It was a lesson, a demonstration, and a reclamation of self-respect all rolled into one. Meanwhile, I quietly gathered practical tools. I made lists, mapped schedules, and even researched legal and logistical steps for managing the house in a way that could surprise them without causing irreversible damage. I documented their predictable routines, timed their errands, and noted the minutiae of their preferences. This wasn't obsessive, it was preparation. Preparation to ensure that when the moment came, there would be no excuses, no wiggle room, and no chance for them to dismiss the impact of my actions. During this period, I also strengthened my emotional resilience. I spent evenings reflecting on the years of dismissal, entitlement, and favoritism, not to wallow, but to internalize lessons and fuel determination. I reminded myself constantly, I wasn't powerless, I wasn't invisible, and I wasn't defined by their treatment of me. Every slight, every exclusion, every casual remark had become data, insight, and motivation. I allowed myself brief moments of anger, but I channeled that energy into planning rather than confrontation. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was acting deliberately, with intention and foresight. I also began imagining possible obstacles. My family was unpredictable, often resorting to guilt, manipulation, or even subtle threats to regain control. I needed contingencies. I considered how they might respond to deviations in household routines, missed chores, or shifts in daily schedules. I mapped out likely reactions, then mentally rehearsed ways to stay calm, maintain control, and continue executing my plan without tipping my hand. It was meticulous work, almost like strategy chess. Each piece moved deliberately, each action calculated for maximum effect. And then, one evening, the perfect opportunity presented itself. My mom and sister were engrossed in planning, reading reviews, comparing hotels, and plotting excursions, completely absorbed in their world without a thought for me. My dad was at his usual post, silently approving everything, unaware that the scaffolding of their authority was beginning to wobble. I watched them, a sense of clarity and resolve settling in my chest. All the preparation, the observation, the quiet reclamation of my agency had led to this point. I didn't yet act, but I knew that when I did, it would be decisive. That night, lying in bed, I reviewed my mental blueprint for the 1000th time. The timing was right. My plan was detailed, layered, and subtle enough to keep them guessing while ensuring the outcome I wanted. I thought about the look on their faces when they realized that I was no longer a passive participant in their lives, when they saw that every expectation, every assumption, every slight and exclusion they had imposed on me would meet with consequences. For the first time, The sense of anticipation was almost overwhelming, but it wasn't fear. It was excitement, focus, and the unshakable certainty that the next move would be mine. I closed my eyes and let the scenario play out in my head. My mom frantically checking lists, my sister fuming over inconveniences that seemed minor but were symbolic, my dad helplessly trying to intervene while their confidence crumbled. Every tiny detail had been accounted for, every contingency mapped, every move carefully orchestrated. And the best part? They had no idea it was coming. This was no longer just about asserting boundaries. It was no longer just about reclaiming control of my life. This was about proving to them, in the most undeniable way possible, that I was no longer the invisible, compliant Benjamin they had relied on for decades. I was the one setting the rules now. And when the day came, when the first domino fell, they would see what it truly meant to underestimate me. I drifted to sleep that night with a strange sense of peace, knowing the next steps were mine to take. I had observed, prepared, and quietly reclaimed pieces of my life. I had allies, strategies, and momentum. All that remained was execution. And when that moment came, I knew the outcome would be satisfying, inevitable, and unforgettable for them and for me. The stage was set, the pieces were in place, and the family who had once dismissed me as invisible would finally realize exactly who I was. The day finally arrived. My family was buzzing with excitement over the vacation, completely oblivious to the storm quietly building in the background. I had been careful, methodical, deliberate in every step leading up to this moment. Weeks of preparation, observation, subtle boundary setting, and quiet defiance had culminated in this exact scenario. I had calculated every detail, the timing, the logistics, the expectations, and the psychological pressure points. I wasn't angry in a reactive sense. I was calm, composed, and more aware of my own power than I had ever been in my life. It began with small, seemingly insignificant adjustments that I had planted over the past weeks. The pantry was reorganized, but in a way that made retrieving ingredients a slow, deliberate process. The cleaning schedule was subtly altered so that chores they assumed were finished on time were now perfectly out of sync with their plans. The pets had been given a slightly different routine, one that would require attention at precisely the wrong moments if they assumed I would handle everything without fail. These tiny, carefully executed changes were invisible to anyone who wasn't looking closely, but they set the stage for the perfect disruption. I greeted my family that morning with a quiet smile, calm and measured, giving no hint of the chaos to come. My mom was frantically checking her lists, my sister was bouncing between her phone and her suitcase, and my dad was offering absent-minded advice, confident that everything was under control. They didn't see me as a threat. They didn't anticipate that I had transformed over the past month from a background character to the one quietly directing the flow of events. And that underestimation was key. The first ripple came when my sister attempted to grab her packed suitcase from the closet. She froze mid-step, blinking at the new arrangement. The bags she had so carefully laid out were subtly blocked by other items I had shifted into place, forcing her to pause, rearrange, and adjust her plans. My mom, noticing the hesitation, began offering frantic, helpful suggestions, which were easily deflected by my calm and deliberate reminders that the new setup was optimized for efficiency, a subtle inversion of the usual dynamic where I had always been the one at her beck and call. Next came the pantry. My mom had asked me to make breakfast for everyone before they left. Normally, I would have moved like clockwork, preparing coffee, toast, and eggs while fielding simultaneous instructions and corrections. But this time, I intentionally timed every step differently, deliberately slowing the process. The cereal boxes were stacked in a way that required extra effort to reach. The coffee machine was preset with a slightly inconvenient configuration, and the eggs were carefully placed in a section that necessitated an extra reach for someone in a hurry. When my mom realized her routine was disrupted, she muttered under her breath, frustrated, while my sister glanced at her phone, confused by the subtle inefficiency. My calm demeanor only heightened their irritation because nothing about me looked out of place. I was smiling politely, making no excuses, yet everything they expected to happen seamlessly was quietly, undeniably off-kilter. By mid-morning, tension had built exponentially. My sister's phone pinged constantly as she attempted to coordinate last-minute activities, But the minor adjustments I had made in their packing arrangements and household setup caused delays that made her flustered, increasingly agitated, and visibly rattled. My mom, normally in control of every minor detail, was now scrambling to adjust, trying to micromanage tasks that had previously required no attention. My dad, seeing the growing chaos, attempted to offer solutions, but his usual nonchalance faltered as he realized that what he assumed would be simple delegation was now slightly, but persistently, off. Then came the pets. I had adjusted their feeding schedule, subtly altering the timing of meals and walks to coincide with moments my family had set aside for packing, checking reservations, and other pre-trip activities. It wasn't chaotic enough to be noticed immediately, but the cumulative effect of minor frustrations began to cascade, producing moments of exasperation and minor conflict. My sister snapped once, muttering under her breath, "Why is this happening now? This isn't supposed to be this hard." My mom tried to interject, only to be interrupted by another small misalignment I had orchestrated. Even my dad looked unsettled, realizing that his quiet assumption that I would handle everything flawlessly had been upended. By noon, the house was in controlled chaos. Not destructive, not dangerous, but disruptive enough to fracture their confidence. The shift in power was palpable. For the first time, they weren't in command. They were reacting. They were struggling to maintain the illusion of control, and it was entirely because I had refused to play the role they had assigned me for decades. I was patient, calm, and deliberate, offering polite suggestions when asked, never raising my voice, but letting the natural consequences of my careful adjustments do the work. The final stroke came when my mom, frustrated beyond measure, attempted to issue a series of last-minute instructions. Normally, I would have complied without question, executing every minor detail while maintaining a calm exterior. But this time, I politely declined, citing the new system I had set up, which was already optimized for efficiency. She attempted to argue, to guilt-trip me, but I remained firm, composed, and unshakable. My sister tried to intervene, but I subtly referenced the rearrangements I had made earlier, pointing out the efficiency benefits in a calm, matter-of-fact tone. My dad, trying to restore order, realized he couldn't impose authority where none existed, because for the first time, I wasn't yielding. The crescendo came as they realized the extent of my quiet revolution. Every expectation they had placed on me for the vacation had been subtly, but irrevocably, altered. My calm, methodical adjustments had turned their world upside down without a single angry confrontation. Their frustration boiled into disbelief as they recognized that I was no longer the invisible servant. They had assumed compliance, but what they faced instead was competence, confidence, and agency that could not be ignored. And then came the moment I had anticipated for weeks. My mom, exasperated, finally raised her hands, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Benjamin, how did you even?" Her words faltered because she didn't have an answer. My sister, fuming, stomped over to the pantry, realizing for the first time that her meticulously planned morning had been quietly disrupted, and the results were entirely intentional. My dad muttered something about needing to rethink their assumptions, but even he understood that the dynamic had shifted in a fundamental, undeniable way. I smiled, quietly, politely, and said nothing. I let them stew in the realization that I had orchestrated everything. No shouting, no dramatics, no confrontation, just calm, methodical precision that left them scrambling to adapt. For decades, they had taken me for granted, assumed I would always comply, assumed I was replaceable. Now they understood, without a word from me, that assumption had been a mistake. By the time they left for the airport, the house was perfectly functional, clean, and well-maintained, but entirely on my terms. Every instruction, every expectation, every carefully constructed routine they had assumed I would follow without question had been subtly shifted, proving the point without breaking anything. The pets were fed, the plants watered, the pantry and kitchen perfectly arranged, but all according to the system I had designed, not theirs. And as the car drove away, leaving me in the quiet house, I felt an overwhelming sense of satisfaction. I had executed my plan without drama, without conflict, without resorting to anger. My revenge wasn't loud or destructive. It was precise, undeniable, and deeply satisfying. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just Benjamin the responsible, the compliant, the invisible. I was Benjamin the capable, the strategic, the one who controlled outcomes without relying on confrontation or luck. I had proven to them, in the most undeniable way possible, that they could not take me for granted, that their assumptions, their favoritism, and their entitlement had limits, and that I was the one setting them now. I sat in the living room, listening to the quiet hum of the house, and allowed myself a long, slow breath. The revenge was complete. I had turned the tables, reclaimed my agency, and demonstrated my worth without a single raised voice. And in that silence, I finally felt free. Free from expectation, free from dismissal, free from a family that had underestimated me for too long. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't understood before. The most satisfying revenge isn't about chaos or confrontation. It's about control. It's about precision. It's about quietly, calmly, methodically reshaping the world so that those who underestimated you finally see the full measure of what you're capable of. As I looked around the house, everything in its place, but now on my terms, I smiled. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving in my family's shadow. I was thriving, and they had no choice but to acknowledge it, whether they wanted to or not. My name's Kyle, I'm 28, and I never thought I'd find myself in a situation where I had to draw a line with my own family. But here I am, standing in my living room, heart racing, trying to keep my voice steady while staring at the people who were supposed to be closest to me. It all started with my brother, Jason. He's 34, always had this way of thinking he's the head of the family, the one whose opinions matter the most, and the rest of us are just background noise. Growing up, Mom used to protect me from a lot of his worst behavior. She'd swoop in when he tried to get us in trouble, when he made fun of me for small things, or when he decided to borrow stuff without asking and then blamed me if it disappeared. But Mom's gone now, and suddenly the family dynamics that had been lurking in the shadows were exposed for what they really were. And Jason? He didn't waste a second to make sure I knew I was still on the bottom. It was a Monday morning when it all came to a head. I just lost my job after months of quietly trying to hold on, and I was emotionally raw, more vulnerable than I wanted to admit. Mom's death 2 years ago had left a void that Jason never acknowledged. To him, it seemed, life was supposed to carry on like nothing had happened. But I had been holding on to memories, to small things that mattered, and for the first time, I realized I couldn't just let his arrogance slide anymore. That morning, Jason had shown up unannounced at my apartment with that smug, superior look he always gets when he thinks he's about to teach me a lesson or get me to cave to his whims. "You've got nothing better to do today, right?" he said, tossing a set of keys onto my counter. "I've got a couple of errands, and Mom always used to say you were good at handling things like this." I froze, keys clattering like a warning bell. The words stung, not because he was asking me for help, but because of the way he said Mom always used to say, as if my own worth was tied to her approval alone. And of course, I knew he was baiting me, seeing how low I could sink without her there to intervene. I didn't say anything at first. I just let him leave the keys on the counter and walked around the apartment, gripping them in my hand, replaying every subtle dig he'd ever made since we were kids. It wasn't just the little things, like claiming my achievements didn't matter or mocking my choices. It was the cumulative effect of a lifetime of being second in every way. My anger simmered under the surface, a quiet determination that I wouldn't let him, or anyone else in my family, treat me like that anymore. I realized I had to set boundaries, not out of spite, but out of necessity. I couldn't let his arrogance overshadow my own life any longer. A few days later, I found out Jason had been quietly meddling in Mom's estate. After her passing, she had left behind a series of instructions that were meant to protect me, small things that guaranteed I had a stake in the things she cared about. Jason, of course, had assumed he could manipulate the situation in his favor. He'd gone behind my back, questioning lawyers, intercepting documents, and talking to relatives as though I didn't exist. When I confronted him about it over the phone, he laughed like it was a joke. "You think Mom cared more about you than me? You're dreaming, Kyle." That was the moment I realized I had to take matters into my own hands. I started gathering evidence quietly. Copies of documents, emails, receipts, anything that showed Jason's interference. Each piece made my resolve stronger, a steady, controlled rage building inside me that wasn't destructive, it was strategic. I wanted him to understand, finally, that the games he had played his whole life had consequences. I wasn't going to scream or cry. I was going to act, and I was going to make sure it hit him in the one place he always underestimated: the truth. The day I decided to confront him, I had everything laid out in front of me. The photos of him taking things that weren't his, the signed papers, the emails showing his manipulation. Dad sat silently beside me, the kind of quiet that made me nervous, because I'd learned over the years that silence from him could mean agreement with Jason, or worse, that he was planning to intervene in a way that would derail everything. I took a deep breath, making sure my nerves didn't betray me. When Jason walked in, that familiar smirk plastered across his face. I could see the first hint of challenge in his eyes. He thought this was just another day of asserting dominance over me. I spoke calmly, more calmly than I felt. "Apologize for what you did to Mom, or leave my house." The words sounded colder and firmer than I expected, but my hand didn't shake as I set the photos and papers on the table between us. Jason scoffed immediately, leaning back in his chair like he had all the time in the world. "You think you're better than us now?" he said, voice dripping with contempt. I ignored the jab, focusing on the calm, controlled fire in my chest. Dad didn't say a word, and for a moment, I thought he might intervene, but he didn't. Jason's eyes flicked to the papers, then back to me, trying to gauge my mood, my confidence. He clearly hadn't expected me to confront him directly, to have the evidence laid out, to have my voice steady and unwavering. 10 minutes into this silent standoff, I noticed a flicker of something in his face, a hesitation, a crack in the armor he always presented. My heart pounded in my chest, not with fear, but with anticipation. I had the upper hand, finally, but I knew better than to rush it. This wasn't about an instant victory. It was about letting him feel the weight of his actions, about giving him a moment to squirm under the truth he had spent years ignoring. And yet, even as I watched him falter slightly, I felt a twinge of unease. This was only the beginning. The real challenge would be maintaining control, keeping him off balance while revealing just enough for him to understand the stakes. I could see his mind working, calculating, probably trying to think of ways to twist the situation, to gaslight me, to make it look like I was overreacting. But this time, I was prepared. Every argument he might throw, every sneer or accusation, I had anticipated. I had the documents, the photos, the proof of his entitlement, his greed, and his disrespect. This was no longer a family disagreement. It was a reckoning. As the minutes dragged on, the air in the room grew heavier. Jason's posture stiffened, his confidence visibly waning, but he wasn't about to back down completely. "You really think showing me a bunch of papers is going to change anything?" he said finally, trying to muster a laugh, though it sounded forced. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let my silence speak, letting the weight of the evidence settle in. The photographs, the signed papers, they weren't just objects. They were proof that his actions had consequences, that the past couldn't be erased by arrogance or entitlement. For the first time in my life, I saw a flicker of vulnerability in Jason. It wasn't defeat yet, but it was close. And I realized something about myself in that moment. I wasn't just standing up to him for Mom or for the estate. I was standing up for myself, for every time I'd felt small, powerless, dismissed. I wasn't going to allow history to repeat itself. I would make him accountable, not out of revenge in the traditional sense, but to establish a boundary that had been ignored for decades. The tension in the room was palpable. Dad's silence weighed like a third presence, neutral but undeniable, and Jason's eyes darted nervously between me, the documents, and Dad. He could feel the walls closing in, though he'd never admit it. And in that moment, I realized the true power of patience and preparation. I had spent years underestimating myself, letting Jason's arrogance dominate my life. Now, I had taken control, carefully, methodically, and I could feel the shift in the balance of power. Jason's face went pale, a reaction that made my stomach twist with satisfaction, but I didn't give him the relief of immediate confrontation. I waited, letting the suspense stretch, letting him realize that he wasn't in charge anymore. My hands rested lightly on the edge of the table, steady and deliberate, while he fidgeted, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. The next move was his to make, or to fail, and I knew, deep down, that when he finally did act, he would realize just how outmatched he was. The tension in the room lingered, thick enough to taste. Even as Jason finally exhaled, a long, slow sigh that sounded more like defeat than relief. I didn't move, I didn't speak. I let him stew in the silence because I wanted him to feel it fully, that moment of vulnerability he had spent years avoiding, hiding behind arrogance and entitlement. For a second, I thought maybe Dad would finally intervene, say something to defuse the situation, but he remained still, silent as always, like he was weighing every word, every gesture. I had always hated that about him. The way he pretended neutrality while his silence often enabled Jason's worst impulses. But today, I didn't need him. I had prepared too carefully, and I knew that, finally, the truth alone would shake Jason in a way words never could. After a long pause, Jason leaned back, his jaw tight. You really think Mom would have wanted you making these decisions? You're just her favorite, right? That's why you got all the attention. His voice had that familiar edge of mockery, but this time, it faltered just a little at the end, betraying the cracks in his confidence. I felt the anger rise, but tempered it with cold focus. This isn't about favoritism, I said evenly. It's about fairness, about the things Mom wanted. You're the one trying to rewrite the rules after she's gone. He scoffed again, but I noticed the difference this time. It wasn't genuine laughter. It was strained, defensive. Jason had always relied on intimidation and ridicule to dominate any conversation, to make people doubt themselves. But now, I was standing solid, unmoved. I could see the calculations in his eyes. How to spin this. How to make it seem like I was overreacting, like I was ungrateful, like I was still small and insignificant. But the papers, the photos, the evidence, they couldn't be argued with. And that, I realized, was why he was struggling. For the next several hours, we went back and forth, a tense, slow battle of wills. Jason tried to charm, to manipulate, to guilt me. You don't need this money or property, Kyle. You've always had it easy, he said at one point, smirking as if he were telling a joke. But I saw right through it. I'd spent my whole life watching him twist words, and now, I had the tools to counter him. I calmly reminded him of the things he had taken, the decisions he had made, the moments he had tried to erase from our family history. Each point landed with quiet precision, a sting he couldn't shrug off. Dad finally spoke around late afternoon, his voice low and careful. Jason, maybe Kyle has a point. Maybe you should consider what he's saying. It wasn't a declaration, not really, but it was enough to make Jason's face twitch with annoyance. Dad had rarely sided with me, and even this small acknowledgement was like lighting a fuse. Jason's lips pressed into a thin line, his nostrils flaring slightly, as he tried to regain control. I don't need lectures from either of you, he said, but there was a hesitation in his tone that hadn't been there before. Hours turned into evening, and the tension didn't let up. I could feel it in my bones, the kind of pressure that builds when long-suppressed resentment and entitlement meet an unmovable force. I kept my voice steady, kept my posture relaxed but deliberate. Every time Jason opened his mouth, I countered with facts, with evidence, with calm reminders of his manipulations. And every time, I saw it in his face. The pride he'd worn like armor was chipping, leaving fear and anger underneath. That night, after he left my apartment with a tight, forced smile, I thought the confrontation was over. But I was wrong. The next morning, I discovered that Jason had gone to the extended family, cousins, aunts, uncles, telling his version of events. He painted me as the villain, accusing me of overreacting, of trying to claim what wasn't mine, of being ungrateful and spiteful. For a moment, I felt that old sting, the isolation I'd always felt when Jason rallied everyone against me. But I quickly reminded myself that I wasn't powerless anymore. I had evidence, and I had the moral high ground. Then came the breaking point. One afternoon, I received a call from a mutual cousin, a distant family member who had always been neutral, sometimes even sympathetic toward me. Their voice trembled on the line. Kyle, Jason, he's done something. He's taken the signed papers from Dad's safe. He's trying to file them as if they're his. He's saying Mom wanted him to have everything, to bypass you entirely. My stomach dropped. I felt a mixture of fury and disbelief. I had known Jason would try to manipulate things, but I hadn't expected him to commit such a blatant betrayal so quickly and so ruthlessly. I called Dad immediately. His voice was cautious, measured. I know, Jason thinks he can get away with it. But we can stop him. There was no urgency, no panic, just a weight of responsibility, of finally being forced to confront decades of silence and favoritism. I realized that my father, who had always been a quiet enabler, was finally acknowledging the truth, though too late to prevent Jason from trying. That alone lit a fire in me. Anger not just at Jason, but at the years of neglect and misplaced priorities that had allowed this to happen. I spent that night preparing for the confrontation I knew had to come next. I printed out copies of every document, organized the photos of Jason taking liberties he had no right to, and even reached out to a lawyer for advice, something I had avoided doing before because I thought it would be too confrontational, too aggressive. But now, it was necessary. I couldn't leave my life, my mother's wishes, or my own dignity in the hands of someone who had spent decades undermining me. By the time Jason arrived the next day, I was ready. He walked in with that smug, confident air he always wore like armor, unaware of the storm waiting for him. "So, what's all this?" he asked casually, glancing at the stack of documents on the table. I ignored his tone, letting the calm authority in my voice do the work. "You've gone too far this time, Jason. I've collected everything: photos, papers, communications. Everything you've done to manipulate Mom's estate, to try to erase me from it. Apologize for what you did, or leave my house." He laughed at first, a nervous laugh, clearly expecting me to cave. But when I didn't respond, when I simply sat back and let the silence stretch, I saw the shift. The flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the twitch in his jaw, it was all there. But I wasn't done. I needed him to feel the weight of his actions, to realize how deep his betrayal ran. "You think you can just rewrite history, Jason?" I said quietly, leaning forward slightly, letting the words sink. "You've spent years treating me like I don't matter, like Mom's wishes don't matter. And now you've tried to steal them. Do you have any idea what that makes you?" His smirk faltered, and I could see him calculating, searching for a way out that didn't exist. The room felt smaller, charged, like every second stretched into eternity. I didn't flinch, didn't blink, and I could see the anger and fear battling in his expression. Dad remained silent, watching carefully, and for the first time, I felt a sense of control that I had never experienced in family confrontations before. Then Jason's face went pale. I didn't need to say anything else. The realization hit him that he couldn't charm, manipulate, or intimidate his way out of this one. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the papers, but I held them back, keeping control. The betrayal, the manipulation, the years of favoritism, they were all laid bare, and for the first time, Jason was powerless. And yet, even as I watched him falter, I knew the real breaking point wasn't just the documents or the evidence. It was the realization that he had underestimated me, that I had grown into someone he could no longer control. That moment of vulnerability, that flash of fear and desperation, was intoxicating in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't satisfaction yet. It was anticipation, the knowledge that the confrontation was only beginning, that the fallout from his actions would be even more devastating. I could feel my heart pounding, my mind racing with the possibilities. Jason would lash out, of course. He always did when cornered. But I was ready for that, too. The slow, deliberate planning, the careful preparation, it all led to this moment, and I could sense the power shifting in my favor. This was more than revenge. It was justice, long overdue. And then it happened. Jason reached for the stack of papers with a sudden, almost violent motion, his face twisting in anger and disbelief. But just as his fingers brushed the top sheet, I moved faster, pushing them away. His expression froze in shock, and for a heartbeat, the room was silent except for our breathing. I realized in that instant that everything had changed. The rules, the power, the family dynamics, all of it had shifted, and there was no going back. I leaned forward, keeping my voice steady but low, deliberate. "One more step, Jason, and you won't like the consequences. You've already crossed the line." His eyes widened, and I could see the wheels turning in his head, frantically trying to figure out how to save face, how to regain control. But this time, there was nothing left for him to grab onto. The betrayal, the favoritism, the arrogance, it had all been exposed. And now, finally, it was time for him to face it. The moment Jason stormed out of my apartment that evening, slamming the door behind him as if trying to erase the evidence of his own humiliation, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The adrenaline that had kept me tense for hours began to ebb, leaving a hollow emptiness behind. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of everything that had been bottled up inside me. The small indignities, the constant dismissals, the way my family had systematically ignored my achievements, my feelings, and even my existence in favor of Jason's ego. And in that quiet, lonely apartment, I hit a kind of rock bottom I hadn't anticipated. Not because of what had just happened, but because I realized how much of my life I had let his entitlement and my family's passivity define. That night, I sat alone, staring at the empty space where the photos and signed papers had been laid out, now shoved back into their folders. My mind raced over every insult Jason had ever hurled, every sneer he had aimed at me, every time he had manipulated Dad or Aunt Miriam or even my distant cousins to make me feel invisible. And yet, beneath the anger and bitterness, a tiny spark of clarity began to form. I had spent decades living under the shadow of entitlement and favoritism, but no one, not Jason, not Dad, not anyone, could take from me what I hadn't willingly handed over. I realized that if I wanted my life to change, if I wanted respect, success, and a sense of self-worth, I couldn't wait for them to give it to me. I had to build it myself. The following days were quiet but purposeful. I started by reclaiming small pieces of my life that had been neglected. I reorganized my apartment, going through boxes of old documents, photos, and keepsakes, separating what mattered to me from what tied me emotionally to Jason's manipulations. Each item I sorted, each drawer I cleared, felt like a small act of rebellion against the years of undervaluation. I wasn't just decluttering a physical space. I was reclaiming my mind, my focus, my sense of self. Next, I turned to the career I had lost. Losing that job had been devastating, but in retrospect, it felt like an opportunity to start over without the constraints of the environment that had never truly appreciated me. I began dedicating myself to freelance work I had always wanted to explore, but had dismissed as impractical or not serious enough. Writing, consulting, small entrepreneurial projects. I approached them all with an intensity one had never allowed myself before. The first weeks were grueling. I struggled to find clients, to gain traction, to maintain a consistent schedule. But with each small success, each payment, each word of positive feedback, I felt the faintest stirrings of pride. Slowly, steadily, I began to feel like I was becoming someone capable of standing on my own. What surprised me most, however, wasn't the work itself, but the way I began to think differently about my family. Instead of obsessing over Jason's arrogance, his entitlement, and Dad's quiet complicity, I started seeing them for what they were, obstacles I had no obligation to entertain. I could acknowledge the hurt they had caused without letting it dictate my life. And with that perspective came a freedom I hadn't known I was missing. I could plan, act, and build without their interference looming over me. Weeks later, I received an unexpected email from a lawyer I had reached out to in the aftermath of the confrontation with Jason. The documents I had provided, combined with my meticulous notes on his interference, gave them a clear case to challenge his attempts to manipulate Mom's estate. They assured me that, legally, I was in a strong position. Reading the email, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: quiet confidence. I wasn't relying on luck, on emotional appeals, or on the pity of relatives. I had prepared, I had gathered evidence, and I had a path forward. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice and reclaiming what was rightfully mine. During this period, I also started taking care of myself physically and mentally. I had always neglected my own health in the years of tension and emotional labor required to navigate my toxic family. I began running in the mornings, clearing my mind as I traced familiar paths through my neighborhood. I joined a small local gym, lifting weights and gradually building strength, feeling my body respond in ways that mirrored my growing inner resilience. I even started therapy, a step I had avoided because I didn't want to admit that my family had caused real, lasting damage. But the sessions became an anchor, a place where I could untangle decades of frustration, anxiety, and self-doubt. Each appointment left me stronger, more self-assured, and more ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. Meanwhile, Jason continued to try to meddle, sending passive-aggressive texts, hinting at family gatherings, and occasionally contacting distant relatives to spin his narrative. but I had stopped responding to his provocations. I realized that every interaction I engaged in with him previously had only fueled his sense of superiority and kept me emotionally tethered to his whims. By refusing to engage, I began to see him as the immature, entitled person he was, not a figure capable of dictating my life or my worth. During this rebuilding phase, I found unexpected allies in people I had always considered peripheral to my life. Friends, former colleagues, even extended family members who had quietly observed the dynamics but never felt empowered to speak up. Their support was subtle but powerful, a shared memory, a confirmation of events, or simply someone listening without judgment. It reminded me that my world didn't have to revolve around the toxic patterns of my immediate family. I could create a network of trust and respect that was independent of Jason's dominance or Dad's silence. I also started documenting everything meticulously. Notes, journals, digital records of communications. All of it served two purposes: as evidence against any future attempts by Jason to manipulate the situation further, and as a personal record of my own progress. Writing down my thoughts, my strategies, my victories, no matter how small, became a form of therapy, a way to chart the trajectory of my rise from the rock-bottom despair I had felt just weeks before. Gradually, the victories, both small and large, started accumulating. I landed a significant freelance contract that paid more than I had earned in my previous full-time role. I signed clients who valued my work and treated me as an equal, giving me autonomy I had never experienced in traditional employment. I began to see my own competence clearly, without the cloud of Jason's shadow hanging over me. Each project, each milestone, reinforced the idea that I was capable of creating a life independent of their drama, one built on my own choices and efforts. As my confidence grew, so did my willingness to assert boundaries more firmly. I started being selective about family interactions, attending gatherings only when necessary, and making it clear that Jason's presence would not be tolerated unless he behaved respectfully. It wasn't about being spiteful. It was about protecting the equilibrium I had worked so hard to establish. And every time he tried to cross the line, I had evidence, I had the law, and I had my own inner strength to counteract him. Through all of this, I learned an essential truth. Self-worth isn't granted by family, by recognition, or even by material success. It comes from action, from resilience, and from the refusal to allow toxic patterns to define who you are. By taking deliberate steps to rebuild, to focus on my career, my health, and my mental clarity, I began to cultivate a sense of security and purpose that Jason's arrogance could no longer shake. But just as the sense of rising from the ashes began to take hold, the calm was shattered by an unexpected twist. One evening, I received a call from Dad. His voice was quiet, hesitant, unusually careful. "Kyle, Jason's done something. He's gone further than I thought possible. You need to see this for yourself." My stomach sank. Despite all the progress I had made, despite all the strength I had cultivated, a cold dread settled over me. Jason had always been unpredictable, and now, it seemed, he was escalating. I drove to Dad's house that night, my mind racing with possibilities. The driveway was quiet, almost eerily so, and when I stepped inside, I immediately sensed that something was off. Dad sat at the kitchen table, holding an envelope in his hands. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes every step feel heavier than it should. He's trying to file documents claiming full control of Mom's estate," Dad said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "And he's got signatures, forged ones. You need to act fast." I felt a rush of anger, disbelief, and fear, all mingling at once. Jason had crossed the line again, pushing into criminal territory. But for the first time, I didn't feel powerless. I had prepared for this. I had the evidence, and I had the resolve. I could handle him. And yet, even with that confidence, a part of me understood that the fallout from this betrayal would be seismic, not just legally, but emotionally. Jason had underestimated me, and now he would learn that his miscalculations had consequences far beyond anything he could have imagined. I spent the next week living in a strange, focused bubble, partly driven by adrenaline, partly by the cold, methodical clarity that comes when you know the rules of the game and are determined to use them. The forged signatures were the provocation, but they had also given me something I hadn't had before: undeniable proof that Jason was willing to cross legal and moral lines to take what wasn't his. That knowledge changed everything. It made my anger practical. It made my plan possible. I started by building a perimeter. I cataloged every scrap of paper, every email, every message that could corroborate Mom's intentions and Jason's attempts to subvert them. I digitized copies of the original signed documents, those safe deposit photos I'd taken weeks earlier, the bank statements showing transfers he'd tried to manipulate, and the text messages where he'd admitted, more than once, that he was sorting things out his way. I stored encrypted backups on cloud accounts he'd never think to check, printed hard copies, and put them in a secure lockbox at a friend's place, and gave a trusted neighbor a key and simple instructions on who to contact if anything happened to me. Paranoia used to feel like a luxury. Now it felt like a necessary tool. Next, I professionalized everything. The lawyer who had initially encouraged me agreed to take the case after seeing the forgeries and the pattern of interference. He was a no-nonsense woman named Elena who cut through sentiment like a scalpel. She didn't coddle feelings, she treated facts. Over coffee in her cluttered office, she laid out the practicalities. What we'd need to freeze if Jason tried to file anything, how to get an emergency injunction, the timeline for filing suit, and the kind of evidence that would make a judge stop and take notice. She also warned me about the emotional fallout, about the ways lawsuits can drag out family relationships and become ugly in public. I appreciated the warning, but I'd already decided I'd rather have ugliness that ended with justice than polite silence that let a thief rewrite my mother's legacy. While Elena handled the legal front, I built a coalition. For years I had assumed family meant a fixed set of people acting in predictable ways, but that assumption had been shattered. Loyalty in families is not binary, it's a web. I started identifying nodes in that web, people whose opinions still mattered in the family machine, but who had been marginalized by Jason's louder voice. Aunt Miriam, who'd always been quietly observant, admitted over tea that she'd suspected Jason of taking liberties but had been afraid of the fallout. Cousin Laura, who lived out of state and had been largely kept out of the family loop, texted me late one night. "If you want, I'll testify." I remember things Mom told me when she thought no one else was listening. Even Dad, after the initial shock and guilt, began to show a slow, clumsy willingness to help. It wasn't wholehearted at first. He had his own shame to work through, but he started to sign off on anything that would keep Jason from moving assets. I reached out to an unexpected ally as well, one of Jason's former business partners, a man named Derek who'd fallen out with him years ago over shady bookkeeping. I approached Derek carefully, knowing Jason would have burned bridges. At our first meeting, tucked in a quiet cafe, Derek's expression softened when I explained what was happening. "I've seen that side of him," he said quietly, more pity than surprise in his voice. "If you have proof, I'll help. I can pull records that show his pattern, his transfers, his fake invoices. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because he did the same thing to me." Derek provided bank statements and screenshots that filled in a gap I hadn't expected. The financial thread that showed Jason's behavior wasn't a single act of desperation, but a pattern. I also started to prepare for the psychological warfare I knew was coming. People like Jason don't give up easily, they double down. So I mapped out likely reactions and planned counters. If he tried to gaslight the family, I'd have sworn statements and witnesses ready. If he attempted to sabotage my reputation, I'd have public records and third-party confirmations to refute his claims. If he tried to turn Dad back into a silent enabler, I'd bring him into the loop with straightforward, simple facts, documents he could hold in his hands, not abstractions. The idea was to make deception hard and exposure inevitable. Financial stability was another pillar of the setup. Although my freelance work had been going well, I knew legal battles and family fallout could drain resources and time. I negotiated a couple of longer-term contracts and took on a small consulting gig that promised steady income. I tightened my budget, but I also invested strategically, hiring a forensic accountant on Elena's recommendation to analyze suspicious transfers and hiring a private investigator to verify a few key claims. That felt excessive at first, but when the PI returned with photos of Jason meeting with a notary I'd never heard of on the same day the forged documents supposedly came into being, the expense felt justified. There was a domestic element to my preparation, too. I changed passwords, updated security on accounts Mom had handled, and notified the bank and the attorney on record that I was the legitimate point of contact for certain affairs. I asked Dad to give me a list of any contacts he'd had with lawyers or banks, people who might be vulnerable to Jason's charm or pressure, and we called them together so there would be a clear paper trail showing who had been informed and when. Every small administrative act was a tiny victory. A lock changed, a signature witnessed, a call logged. Emotionally, I fortified myself in ways that surprised me. Where once I had measured my worth by my family's validation, I now drew strength from the way strangers and peripheral family members responded to the truth. I started journaling not to catalog evidence, but to record my values, what I would and would not accept, how I wanted to behave under pressure. I made rules for myself. No public attacks, no sensationalism on social media, no baiting. Elena agreed. She said anger was natural, but that a judge preferred dispassionate facts over performative outrage. That message became a kind of moral scaffold for me. I would be strategic, not vengeful. I wanted consequences for Jason, but not cruelty for cruelty's sake. Still, even with all the planning, there were personal risks. I had to prepare for being ostracized, for the possibility Dad would slip back into silence, for Jason to try to manufacture crises to distract everyone. I rehearsed conversations in my head. How to respond if an aunt accused me of making a mountain of a molehill. How to steady my voice if a cousin showed me a family photo and asked, "Are you sure?" I practiced not flinching when people tried to minimize what had happened. In those rehearsals, something else shifted. My fear gave way to a quiet steadiness. I began to relish the role of the person who would follow through, not because I wanted to punish, but because I believed in upholding what my mother had wanted. Slowly, deliberately, I set the trap. I arranged a family meeting under the pretense of sorting everything out with the estate. It was the perfect stage, a neutral space, witnesses present, a notary there to confirm signatures, and Elena available to advise. I told a few carefully chosen relatives, those I trusted, to attend, framing it as a family mediation. I made sure the date was when key allies could be present: Aunt Miriam, Cousin Laura, Derek, and the notary who'd handled some of Mom's paperwork years before. Dad agreed to be there, which felt almost miraculous. I gave him a simple brief. Sit, listen, hand over the safe deposit key if asked, and don't be bullied. I bought myself small comforts in the days leading up to the meeting. New shirts, extra coffee, a playlist of songs that put me in the right mood. Steady, not frantic. I read through the documents with Elena twice, asking questions until I could answer every what if she posed. Each time I solved a potential loophole, my anxiety ebbed. Control, I discovered, is less about dominating people and more about eliminating surprises. The morning of the meeting dawned clear and oddly calm. I felt like a man about to walk into a crucible. Nervous, yes, but not naive. Dad arrived early, looking older than I remembered, his hands a little shakier when he handed me the safe deposit envelope. Be fair, he said quietly, and it felt like an apology and a blessing in one. We arrived at the neutral venue together, an old community center room with large windows and a long table that seemed to amplify voices. People trickled in, Aunt Miriam with her soft eyes, Laura scanning the room as if measuring the scene, Derek with a guarded expression, and, last to enter, Jason, oiled smile in place, swagger barely contained. He acted like he'd already won. He sat down with that easy confidence and started with his usual charm: offensive jokes, false concern, a performance of wounded brotherly love. Look at us, trying to sort out a messy misunderstanding, he said, smiling at Dad as if to cement an alliance. But the notary was there, Elena was to my left, and the documents were arranged. I felt the air change as the room realized this wasn't casual. This was official. I opened with a quiet statement of intent. No flourish, no theatrics. I explained why we were there, what had been found, and what we needed to resolve. Jason's face went through the micro-expressions I'd learned to read. First irritation, then anger, then the practiced facade of control. He tried to interject, to tell a version that painted me as unreasonable, but Elena cut him off with a calm, "We'll address your statements in order." That line was the hinge. It made the room lean into process over posturing. And then, just as I was about to hand over a folder of evidence to the notary and request that the bank freeze any attempted filings, the door to the meeting room opened, and Dad's neighbor, Mrs. Kostovic, who'd promised to come as a witness, stepped in with an envelope in her hand. Her face was pale. "I thought you should see this," she said, voice trembling. "I found it in Jason's car yesterday while bringing your mail back." I didn't want to believe it. She handed me a single sheet that none of us expected, a bank-certified letter that showed a recent transfer out of an account linked to Mom's estate, one that had been moved to a shell account with Jason's name on the file. The room went very quiet. Jason's jaw clenched, and for a split second I saw him. Not the charming brother, not the swaggering bully, but a small, cornered animal. My pulse quickened. This was the moment I had been preparing for. This was the perfect opportunity to corner him with a combination of legal proof, witnesses, and process. I felt Elena's hand brush mine, steady, invisible encouragement, and then Jason rose from his chair. I spent the next week living in a strange, focused bubble, partly driven by adrenaline, partly by the cold, methodical clarity that comes when you know the rules of the game and are determined to use them. The forged signatures were the provocation, but they had also given me something I hadn't had before: undeniable proof that Jason was willing to cross legal and moral lines to take what wasn't his. That knowledge changed everything. It made my anger practical. It made my plan possible. I started by building a perimeter. I cataloged every scrap of paper, every email, every message that could corroborate Mom's intentions and Jason's attempts to subvert them. I digitized copies of the original signed documents, those safe deposit photos I'd taken weeks earlier, the bank statements showing transfers he'd tried to manipulate, and the text messages where he'd admitted, more than once, that he was sorting things out his way. I stored encrypted backups on cloud accounts he'd never think to check, printed hard copies, and put them in a secure lockbox at a friend's place, and gave a trusted neighbor a key and simple instructions on who to contact if anything happened to me. Paranoia used to feel like a luxury. Now it felt like a necessary tool. Next, I professionalized everything. The lawyer who had initially encouraged me agreed to take the case after seeing the forgeries and the pattern of interference. He was a no-nonsense woman named Elena who cut through sentiment like a scalpel. She didn't coddle feelings, she treated facts. Over coffee in her cluttered office, she laid out the practicalities. What we'd need to freeze if Jason tried to file anything, how to get an emergency injunction, the timeline for filing suit, and the kind of evidence that would make a judge stop and take notice. She also warned me about the emotional fallout, about the ways lawsuits can drag out family relationships and become ugly in public. I appreciated the warning, but I'd already decided I'd rather have ugliness that ended with justice than polite silence that let a thief rewrite my mother's legacy. While Elena handled the legal front, I built a coalition. For years I had assumed family meant a fixed set of people acting in predictable ways, but that assumption had been shattered. Loyalty in families is not binary, it's a web. I started identifying nodes in that web, people whose opinions still mattered in the family machine, but who had been marginalized by Jason's louder voice. Aunt Miriam, who'd always been quietly observant, admitted over tea that she'd suspected Jason of taking liberties but had been afraid of the fallout. Cousin Laura, who lived out of state and had been largely kept out of the family loop, texted me late one night. "If you want, I'll testify." I remember things Mom told me when she thought no one else was listening. Even Dad, after the initial shock and guilt, began to show a slow, clumsy willingness to help. It wasn't wholehearted at first. He had his own shame to work through, but he started to sign off on anything that would keep Jason from moving assets. I reached out to an unexpected ally as well, one of Jason's former business partners, a man named Derek who'd fallen out with him years ago over shady bookkeeping. I approached Derek carefully, knowing Jason would have burned bridges. At our first meeting, tucked in a quiet cafe, Derek's expression softened when I explained what was happening. "I've seen that side of him," he said quietly, more pity than surprise in his voice. "If you have proof, I'll help. I can pull records that show his pattern, his transfers, his fake invoices. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because he did the same thing to me." Derek provided bank statements and screenshots that filled in a gap I hadn't expected. The financial thread that showed Jason's behavior wasn't a single act of desperation, but a pattern. I also started to prepare for the psychological warfare I knew was coming. People like Jason don't give up easily, they double down. So I mapped out likely reactions and planned counters. If he tried to gaslight the family, I'd have sworn statements and witnesses ready. If he attempted to sabotage my reputation, I'd have public records and third-party confirmations to refute his claims. If he tried to turn Dad back into a silent enabler, I'd bring him into the loop with straightforward, simple facts, documents he could hold in his hands, not abstractions. The idea was to make deception hard and exposure inevitable. Financial stability was another pillar of the setup. Although my freelance work had been going well, I knew legal battles and family fallout could drain resources and time. I negotiated a couple of longer-term contracts and took on a small consulting gig that promised steady income. I tightened my budget, but I also invested strategically, hiring a forensic accountant on Elena's recommendation to analyze suspicious transfers and hiring a private investigator to verify a few key claims. That felt excessive at first, but when the PI returned with photos of Jason meeting with a notary I'd never heard of on the same day the forged documents supposedly came into being, the expense felt justified. There was a domestic element to my preparation, too. I changed passwords, updated security on accounts Mom had handled, and notified the bank and the attorney on record that I was the legitimate point of contact for certain affairs. I asked Dad to give me a list of any contacts he'd had with lawyers or banks, people who might be vulnerable to Jason's charm or pressure, and we called them together so there would be a clear paper trail showing who had been informed and when. Every small administrative act was a tiny victory, a lock changed, a signature witnessed, a call logged. Emotionally, I fortified myself in ways that surprised me. Where once I had measured my worth by my family's validation, I now drew strength from the way strangers and peripheral family members responded to the truth. I started journaling not to catalog evidence, but to record my values, what I would and would not accept, how I wanted to behave under pressure. I made rules for myself: no public attacks, no sensationalism on social media, no baiting. Elena agreed. She said anger was natural, but that a judge preferred dispassionate facts over performative outrage. That message became a kind of moral scaffold for me. I would be strategic, not vengeful. I wanted consequences for Jason, but not cruelty for cruelty's sake. Still, even with all the planning, there were personal risks. I had to prepare for being ostracized, for the possibility Dad would slip back into silence, for Jason to try to manufacture crises to distract everyone. I rehearsed conversations in my head. How to respond if an aunt accused me of making a mountain of a molehill. How to steady my voice if a cousin showed me a family photo and asked, "Are you sure?" I practiced not flinching when people tried to minimize what had happened. In those rehearsals, something else shifted. My fear gave way to a quiet steadiness. I began to relish the role of the person who would follow through, not because I wanted to punish, but because I believed in upholding what my mother had wanted. Slowly, deliberately, I set the trap. I arranged a family meeting under the pretense of sorting everything out with the estate. It was the perfect stage, a neutral space, witnesses present, a notary there to confirm signatures, and Elena available to advise. I told a few carefully chosen relatives, those I trusted, to attend, framing it as a family mediation. I made sure the date was when key allies could be present: Aunt Miriam, Cousin Laura, Derek, and the notary who'd handled some of Mom's paperwork years before. Dad agreed to be there, which felt almost miraculous. I gave him a simple brief: sit, listen, hand over the safe deposit key if asked, and don't be bullied. I bought myself small comforts in the days leading up to the meeting: new shirts, extra coffee, a playlist of songs that put me in the right mood. Steady, not frantic. I read through the documents with Elena twice, asking questions until I could answer every what if she posed. Each time I solved a potential loophole, my anxiety ebbed. Control, I discovered, is less about dominating people and more about eliminating surprises. Jason's rise from smug arrogance to pale panic happened in seconds, like watching a mountain crumble in slow motion. Standing in that room, with the notary, Elena, Aunt Miriam, Cousin Laura, Derek, Dad, and Mrs. Kostovic as witnesses, I realized that everything I had spent months preparing, the research, the alliances, the legal groundwork, was about to pay off. My pulse was steady, my breath controlled. This was the moment every careful step, every strategic call, every late night spent planning had been leading to. Jason fumed, his hands gripping the back of his chair as if it could anchor him against the storm of consequences crashing down. He opened his mouth, probably intending a snide comment, but Elena cut in first, calm and precise. Jason, everything Kyle presented is verifiable, documented, and legally actionable. Your attempts to manipulate the estate are not only void, they're criminal. Forged signatures, unauthorized transfers, deceptive filings. They leave you no room for plausible deniability. Her words landed like hammers, final and uncompromising. I stepped forward slowly, holding the folder of evidence I had organized with almost obsessive precision. Jason, I said, my voice quiet but icy. You've spent your entire life thinking you could rewrite reality, bend it to your will, and intimidate anyone who opposed you. Today that ends. Every forgery, every lie, every manipulation. You tried to erase decades of my life, our mother's intentions, and even basic fairness. And today, you are accountable. He sneered, but the confidence was hollow. I had expected him to argue, to launch into a tirade, to charm his way out. But the room had shifted. The witnesses were neutral, informed, and firm. The notary had the papers, Elena had legal authority, and I had meticulous documentation. Jason realized this wasn't a negotiation. It was an inescapable reckoning. I handed the notary a set of documents, neatly organized, highlighting each fraudulent act. These are copies of every forged signature, every unauthorized transfer, and the communications that prove intent. We're submitting them to the court today. Any attempt to dispute them without evidence will fail, and any interference with the process will be considered contempt. The silence was deafening. Jason's face shifted through disbelief, anger, and finally the pale panic I had been waiting for. He had never encountered a situation where his manipulations couldn't succeed. For the first time, he realized that charm, intimidation, and entitlement had limits. Aunt Miriam leaned forward, her voice quiet but pointed. Jason, I've watched you exploit, lie, and manipulate for years. Not just to me, not just to Kyle, but to Mom. You don't get to continue that legacy. You've been given your chance, and you blew it. Cousin Laura added, we believed Mom wanted fairness, not favoritism. And Kyle, he's done nothing but honor her wishes. You've gone too far, and now everyone here sees it. Dad, sitting quietly until now, finally spoke. His voice trembled slightly, but it carried authority. Jason, you've made choices that I didn't fully stop before. I thought staying silent was safer, easier. I was wrong. Today, you face the consequences of your actions. I will no longer enable your manipulations. Jason's smirk dissolved into a twitching, uncertain frown. He glanced at the envelopes, the papers, the witnesses, and finally, at me. You can't do this, he muttered, though there was no conviction in the words. I shook my head slowly. I don't need to do anything, Jason. The law, the truth, and every person in this room ensure that your actions cannot succeed. You've cornered yourself, and now the consequences are inevitable. You've underestimated me, underestimated Mom, underestimated the people you thought were loyal. And that's the only mistake you can't recover from. Elena gestured to the notary, who began officially recording the evidence. The documents were signed, verified, and time-stamped. Every fraudulent transfer was flagged, every forged signature notarized as invalid. Every attempt Jason had made to manipulate the estate exposed in meticulous detail. Derek provided corroborating financial records. Aunt Miriam and Cousin Laura gave sworn statements about past incidents, and Dad's account verified the rightful ownership of assets. I watched Jason's face as the weight of the legal and social collapse sank in. His eyes darted, searching for a loophole, a witness, anything to regain leverage, but there was none. Each fact was unassailable, each ally unwavering, each document an airtight pillar of truth. The smugness that had defined him for decades evaporated. He was reduced to a man trapped by his own greed and arrogance. And then came the final blow. The bank confirmed that all pending transfers had been frozen, any unauthorized withdrawals reversed, and any filings Jason attempted would be legally null. The reality hit him like a physical force. He slumped into his chair, pale, quiet, utterly defeated. I took a step closer, keeping my voice calm, deliberate. This isn't about humiliation, Jason. It's about accountability. You thought you could erase me, rewrite Mom's legacy, and manipulate the people around you. You failed. And now you must live with the consequences of every choice you've made. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. The room's silence pressed against him like a weight he couldn't lift. For the first time, I saw the human underneath the mask, a man terrified of exposure, stripped of entitlement, powerless in the face of the law and family united against deception. As the witnesses began leaving, Elena handed me a folder with the finalized records and a short, professional smile. Everything is documented. You're fully protected. You've done this legally, methodically, and smartly. No chance for retaliation. I nodded, relief mixing with satisfaction. Months of careful planning, late nights, and meticulous preparation had culminated in this moment. Jason's empire of manipulation had crumbled, not with shouting or threats, but with precision, patience, and truth. Even Dad, whose silence had haunted me for decades, gave a small, rare smile. You handled this well. Mom would be proud. I felt a warmth in that acknowledgement, a quiet validation that no victory over Jason alone could have offered. The final act came quietly but decisively. Jason left the room, escorted by Derek to ensure he didn't attempt any immediate interference. His last glance at me was a mixture of disbelief, shame, and rage, emotions he would carry for a long time, and ones that would remind him of his failure every time he tried to claim authority over our family. After the door closed behind him, I finally exhaled fully. The weight of years, decades even, of frustration, betrayal, and undervaluation lifted in a single, liberating moment. My life, my mother's intentions, and my own dignity were restored. I looked around the room at the allies who had stood with me. Aunt Miriam, Cousin Laura, Derek, Elena, Dad. They weren't just witnesses. They were the embodiment of truth and fairness, and their presence confirmed that the right path, however difficult, had prevailed. I gathered the documents, carefully filing them in a secure place, knowing that they represented more than legal protection. They were a testament to perseverance, strategy, and patience. Every moment of planning, every sleepless night, every meticulous note had culminated in this undeniable reality. Jason's power was broken. As I finally stepped outside into the evening air, a quiet calm settled over me. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the street, but I didn't flinch. I didn't hesitate. For the first time in my life, I felt the weight of true agency, the satisfaction of having acted with intelligence, restraint, and precision. My family's drama, my mother's legacy, my own self-respect, they were finally intact, safeguarded by strategy and unwavering resolve. And as I stood there, watching the sky turn gold, I realized one final truth. No amount of entitlement, arrogance, or manipulation can withstand careful preparation, unwavering conviction, and the relentless pursuit of justice. The past had tried to define me, my brother had tried to erase me, and even my father's silence had threatened to keep me small. But in the end, I had risen, not with rage, not with impulsive confrontation, but with patience, intelligence, and truth. Jason would carry the memory of this defeat with him forever. And me? I walked away lighter, stronger, and finally free, knowing that some victories aren't loud or dramatic. They're quiet, meticulous, and complete. The weight of his betrayal had been turned into the foundation of my triumph, and I knew, deep in my bones, that no one would ever undermine me again. The final line, whispered to myself as I locked the door behind me, was simple but resolute. I had finally taken my life back, and no one, not even him, could touch it again.